One of the things that's been kind of interesting about this whole process is to understand how the Rural America Ministries Network took place. We are seeing an awakening of rural ministry focus that we have not seen in years and years and years and years. And I'm encouraged by that. We should have learned. Let me give you an illustration real quickly. How many of you remember what we called in the Assemblies of God the decade of harvest? Hands all over. I hate to admit this, I was in Springfield at the time. The decade of harvest was an absolute unmitigated flop. It just didn't go. And it was interesting because if any place should have gone, it should have been the United States. But the United States saw very little growth during that period of time. And yet we had set lofty goals to see some great things happen. There's been a subtle shift, and I am not in any way opposed to big. As Joel mentioned earlier, big has some great opportunities and opportunities for ministry. But our focus has been that for perhaps the last 30, 40 years. While we did not grow in the decade of harvest at all, there were other countries that saw amazing growth. And when we heard about that, we began to ask some questions. Let me give you a classic illustration. Assemblies of God grew very little during that period of time in our decade of harvest, but the Philippine Islands during that period of time, for a period at least, was growing at the rate, numerically, at the rate of nearly 1,500 people per day. That's pretty good growth. I had an opportunity to go and visit the fastest growing church in the Philippines. They asked me to come, had an opportunity to be there, and I remember looking forward to preaching on that first Sunday. I expected thousands. In the first service, there were 200 people in attendance. Second service, there wasn't one. That was the end. And this was supposed to be the fastest growing church in the Assemblies of God. When it was all over, I looked at the pastor when we went out to eat, and I said to him, I said, Pastor, how large was your church when you came to pastor it? He said, about 200. I said, how large was your church a year after you came? He said, about 200. I said, how large was your church 5 years after you were there? He said, about 200. And I looked at him because here my mind is just clouded. How can this happen where this is supposed to be the fastest growing church in the Philippines in the Assemblies of God? Then he looked at me and he smiled and he said, oh, my brother, I fear that you misunderstand. My church will always be 200 people. But in the 7 years that I have pastored, we have started 37 other churches. And they are 200 also. While our focus was on big and bigger, their focus was upon developing a church that represented health. And we already have that in many, many cases. Now, just because a church is small doesn't mean it's healthy. I know that from personal experience. Very first church I pastored was a little church in the Black Hills. 13 people attended that church. My wife and I went with just a newborn child. My entire pay for that period of time was $28 a week. That's all I got. Some of you know that kind of struggle, so I had to get a job, and I found myself getting a job as a logger. And I would go up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I would log in the woods in the Black Hills. And then during the other 2 days before Sunday, I worked as a disc jockey in Rapid City, South Dakota. Now that was my first introduction to rural ministry. I was born and raised in a rural community in northwestern Montana. How many of you know that Montana has got a unique culture? It's even unique from all of you over here in the Northwest. Let me give you an illustration. In Montana, if something scares you, shoot it. Just that simple. It's a culture that's there. You see the rest of the culture on the back, on the bumper sticker of the car. I love this bumper sticker in Montana. The bumper sticker said, the word vegetarian is just an old Indian word that means poor hunter. So you look at all of that kind of culture. Well, I had to find some work, and so I remember driving home one night after being up in the woods, and an amazing thing took place. A deer jumped out in front of my car, and I hit it in the head and killed it. I had a problem. I climbed out of the car, walked over to where the deer was laying there in the ditch dead, and all I could see was not a dead deer. All I could see was 150 pounds of meat because I was in that position. Had a couple of problems. I didn't have a knife. You should always have a knife when you're traveling in the woods, but I didn't have one. I wasn't about to let the meat go to waste, so I hiked up to the top of a hill that was there. I broke off an 8-inch chunk of barbed wire, and I came back down, and I gutted that entire deer out with an 8-inch chunk of barbed wire. I got to tell you, folks, you have never worked as hard as I've worked gutting a deer on that night. And I remember sawing away at that, thinking to myself, this is not why I was called into the ministry. This wasn't part of what they trained me. But I was sharing that with a group of young people not long ago, and one of the young people looked at me and he said, Wes, what kind of lesson can you learn from that experience? I think I learned the most important lesson I've ever learned in my life. Here's the lesson. I learned that God will never be all that you need unless at some point in your life, He's all that you have. And that's an important lesson for all of us to learn. It has nothing to do in itself with rural or any other areas, but that's a part of what we deal with. And so some years ago, the Lord laid upon my heart a desire to actually see a new focus developed in rural ministry across our nation. Not just in 1 or 2 districts, but across our nation. I had to set it on the side for a period of time because of some other activities. They asked me to come back on board as the discipleship director. I had been that for 18 years. So I set that off to the side, and then just before our last general council, I went to talk to Brother Wood. When I went to visit with Brother Wood and tell him about the vision that God had laid on my heart with this, when I told him about it, he came up out of his chair. It's something I've never seen him react that way to. He sat down and he said, Wes, if you had come to me 1 month ago, you would not have the reaction you have right now. But he said, for the first time, I visited an effective rural church. This was in South Texas. And he said, let me tell you about it. So he has asked for us to move this forward. It's what has actually happened. And we're moving forward. Now, we had to put it kind of on a hold while a new administration stepped into the office at that point, but aggressively we're seeing some exciting things happen. Let me walk through this real quickly with you and just show you where we're at on some of this concept and some of the issues that we're facing. Question was asked earlier, what is rural? It's interesting when you look at rural. Census Bureau defines rural this way. Urbanized areas are 50,000 or more people. Urban clusters are at least 10,000 but have less than 50,000 people. Everything else, not included, is rural. So here's the bottom line. In other words, rural is defined not by what it is, it's defined by what it isn't. And that happens in a whole lot of areas, sometimes even in the ministry that we face. Look at the next one that we're looking at. In our latest census, 59.5 million people, or almost 20% of the population, was considered rural. And it was divided primarily into these 5 areas. Every one of them are, to be honest with you, represented right here in Oregon. And they're represented in other states. It's changing dramatically. For instance, there's Caucasian, Latinos, Asians, African Americans, Native Americans. Native Americans alone have 500, and I believe it is 68 different tribes in the United States. Of the 568 tribes, 260 of them are in Alaska alone. And it's interesting as we begin to reach out. When I grew up in western Montana, I grew up on an Indian reservation in western Montana called the Flathead Indian Reservation, Salish Kootenai. And you have other reservations right here that need a special touch of God and ministry that's there. You're going to have to look at it. Here's the question, what does rural look like in the assemblies of God? Population of 50,000 to 10,000 is 23%. Population of 50,000 or more is 33%. Rural comprises a minimum of 44% of the Assemblies of God. And that isn't exactly clear either, because we wanted to take a look at demographics. And there are some areas whereby rural is a part of the United States demographics in larger communities, because it's a culture. We estimate that approximately 60% of our Assemblies of God churches are rural churches. So the question that automatically arises is, how in the world would we set that aside? Now here's a question. What actually comes to mind when you hear the word rural? You see all those pictures around there. That's usually what we think about. But let's go to the next slide and quickly identify some things that are important. When you take a look at these three different pictures, you see the basic demographics. Up in the upper left hand is where I'm from. It's a tourist area. You have a lot of tourist areas here, but they are rural areas, very rural areas. And they're going through cataclysmic changes. You've got the cattle industry. The one in the middle at the top is actually what we call extraction services. And that has some of the most rural communities that you will see, where they mine coal. In Williston, North Dakota, where we pastored for 10 years in that community, oil and extraction of oil has taken over the community. And the things that are happening in that rural community can almost make you sick. It's an amazing thing. For instance, my son began a ministry some years ago called Free International, which ministers primarily to girls that are caught in human trafficking. You know where one of the biggest human trafficking areas are? In the rural community, among two specific groups. Extraction services, where you have oil and coal, and the second is Native American. Those two areas we're dealing with in some big ways. The mountain areas that are there, the grain areas that are there, the one at the very bottom is Louisiana, actually, where you have rice and where you have shrimp farms and where you have other areas. We don't think of that in terms of rural here in the Northwest, but I got to tell you folks, that's rural. And we have to find a way somehow to move beyond our normal regional thought as to what God wants to do across the whole area. Now let's take it a little bit further. Let's just look at the definition of rural, setting the parameters. Geography and demographics have to be a part of it. Economy has to be a part of it. Population characteristics have to be a part of it. Our mindset or values, that includes tradition, life roles, the land, experience, and time, all of that goes into the concept of rural. So when we begin to develop a ministry to rural, we have to understand what it's all about. Next slide, please. I wrote this down because I love the statement that's there. The reality we must embrace for effective rural ministry is that rural is not defined by the size or population of the community alone. The term is best defined as a unique and diverse culture that requires unique and diverse ministry. It will require effective, creative leaders and shepherds who will by faith see the true potential of spiritual harvest and commit themselves to that calling. I was so encouraged by what Joel has shared tonight. And I tell you honestly, it's something we desperately need across our movement in so many different ways. Next slide, please. Here's the challenges we're facing. I'm going through them quickly so that you'll understand it. Often struggle with feelings of insignificance and isolation. Hear me carefully, those of you that are involved in rural ministry. You are not insignificant. Sometimes we're treating people that way, but it's not based upon facts. Let me throw a couple of things out to you quickly. Are you aware of the fact that over 2/3 of our entire missionary task force comes from rural America? And all but one of our general superintendents comes from rural America. And his parents pastored a rural church later in life. There is something about the rural culture, if we approach it correctly, that develops leaders. It's amazing. It's powerful. You watch it on a Sunday morning, people. It just blows you away. In a large church setting, what you will actually have is almost a show on the platform. Nothing wrong with that. You have people that audition for the parts, audition with their voice, their instruments. But in many of our rural communities, we don't have that. It's not uncommon to see a 9-year-old girl standing by an 80-year-old woman and singing together in a worship team. And some would look at that and say, that's not acceptable. Folks, it's not only acceptable, it's something that we ought to use. Because that little 9-year-old girl is going to find a time in her life when she will remember that opportunity and the commitment to ministry. Ministry is viewed as transitionary. Most of our rural communities have approximately a 2 to 3 year period of time where they enjoy the presence of an existing pastor. Did you hear what I said? So we all come with these different concepts, and that pastor steps into the community and says, I've got to develop a vision statement and a person statement. So they develop, the pastor does, a vision statement and a purpose statement, shares it with the congregation, and 2 years later he leaves, and the next pastor comes in and changes the whole thing. You know what has to happen in a rural community? The congregation needs to develop the mission statement and the vision statement, and the pastor has to help them facilitate it. That's a part of what we deal with. They're underfunded and under-resourced. There's little understanding of the unique culture and ministry in rural America. Educational opportunities for pastors are sometimes limited. I'm excited to hear what you're doing here. Let me share with you how we're seeing a groundswell of new education. Beginning this fall, Southwestern Assemblies of God University is beginning a rural course, undergraduate courses for students. I have the privilege of directing it and teaching that. I'm excited about it. Trinity Bible College in Ellendale, North Dakota. You can't get more rural than that. Trinity Bible College has developed a master's program for that. So there is a movement back toward training our pastors in this area. Pastors' financial support is often lacking. Here's something that I think we don't understand in our rural areas. We see bivocation often as transitionary. But bivocation in many of our communities is not only acceptable, it's desirable. Some of the most effective ministry that I have done was ministry that included bivocational work and ministry as well. Let me share something with you. I was asked some time ago to consider pastoring a larger church. It wasn't a mega church, it ran about 700 people. But it was a good-sized church. I couldn't feel free to do that, and I ultimately said no. And I'll never forget when the board said, all right, Brother Bartel, we'll accept that, but it's no. But do you mind if we ask you some questions? And we had about an hour's time of asking questions. One of the questions he asked was this: if you were to pastor today after all your years in ministry, what would you do differently? Hear me carefully. I gave him two things. I said, number one, I would probably intentionally tick everybody off. He said, what do you mean by that? I said, well, somehow we have to move ourselves away from being a consumer-driven culture where people choose churches based on the worship styles and issues, and they begin to understand that it's not about us, it's about Him. All right? That's important. The second thing that I told him I would do is that I would never pastor again without working at least 2 days a week in an outside job. I don't care how large the church. And my staff would do the same. Many of our pastors have lost touch with their communities, and the only thing they see is what happens in the four walls of that church. Next slide. So here's what we're going to do. This is the missionary mandate that we're dealing with. Number one, elevate the visibility of rural ministry. We want to begin to see the stories of rural pastors in our magazines. We want to see it in a number of different ways where we can show that God is at work in rural America. Secondly, provide active encouragement for those called to rural America. We believe that there are people who are called to a lifetime of service in rural America. I found myself in that role, many, many different ways. Some of them were different. For instance, I told you about the church that was just 13 people. We didn't worry about small groups. We were a small group. So we didn't try to initiate it. But I went to another church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This church had been an independent church. The building would seat 1,500 people. But the Sunday that I went there were only 97 people in attendance. And it was the most dysfunctional place I've ever been. They had a lady there. I finally got her moved up to the front, but they had a lady in the church, if she didn't like what you preached on, she'd spit at you. That's a new experience. I'd never had that before. Provide active encouragement for those called to rural America. Provide an effective network within the Assemblies of God for existing ministries. Notice what our title says. It does not say Rural America Ministries. It actually is Rural America Ministries Network. We don't need to duplicate what others are doing. We need to support them. So if what Joel is talking about with the educational concept that they're doing actually at Northwest, rather than trying to create something exactly like that, let's find a way to support that and encourage it spread throughout the whole area. We have ministries, for instance, like Rural Compassion that's doing a great job. Steve Donaldson is involved with that. We have another one in Texas that's called the Water Tower Project, which is a ranch that was actually given, and it's growing. We're going to support that. We have the Acts 2 Journey, which is one of the most effective church growth and church revitalization systems I've ever run into. And we have a church planting network now that's focusing towards church growth. Some things we will do new, other things we will network and support. All right? Promote effective resources and assist in creation of new initiatives. For instance, a church needs some help. They need to put a new roof on their church. Where can they go to get it? In most cases, it's only the district, and many times the district doesn't have that much. So we're actually raising funds to be able to assist rural churches in doing those kind of things. Just this coming month or 2 months, we're actually going to be totally replacing the roof on 2 rural churches so that they can move ahead with what they're doing and let God do some things. We've actually begun to purchase some trailers that will help us get equipment and material to those churches and help it. We need to do that regionally. Here's another one. Encourage and assist in rural educational opportunities. Not everybody can attend an undergraduate course or a cohort. What we can do is provide some educational resources on the web that can address some of these things and help rural pastors. All right? Next, provide additional educational resources. Why is there 3 of them just about like that? Provide educational scholarships. That's the one I was looking at. So an individual wants to be able to go to school. We want to be able to help him to go to school, especially if he's willing to get involved in rural ministry. So here's what we do. We actually give him, say, a $10,000 or a $20,000 scholarship to be able to go to school. Then if he will remain in the church that he's pastoring for at least 4 years, that scholarship will be completely forgiven. Now, I have individuals that are coming alongside and supporting that through AG Trust, so we're able to see some exciting new possibilities with that. Initiate national network opportunities, and then assist in active church planting and church revitalization for rural areas. Wow, we got our hands full. But it is exciting to see what the Lord is doing with all of this. And I want to thank you so much for allowing me just to share some of this concept, because I believe that it's time for us to begin to see what God is doing in our small churches and rural communities and elevate the view of what's happening. I close with this. I was in a meeting some time ago where individuals were talking about church growth. The man that was teaching that course made a statement that caused me to sit right up on end. Now, I have to be honest with you. I have a very low tolerance for dumb. And I've developed that primarily because I've had to deal with it so often in my own life. So I've had to address that issue. I have a simple policy, for instance, of confrontation that I've embraced all of my life. Would you like to know what my policy for confrontation was when I pastored? It was simple, simply this: avoid confrontation if at all possible. However, if it becomes necessary, make it memorable. And that's worked in more cases than I care to state. But we were sitting in this room, and one of the most foolish statements that I've ever heard in my life came out of this leader. I will not pinpoint him or even give you a hint of who it was. But this leader made a statement. He said, if a church, after beginning, has not reached at least 1,000 people within 10 years after its birth, it should be closed. I got to tell you, every fiber of my being was there. So I asked this simple question. I said, did I hear you right? He said, yes. I said, well, then let me give you a scenario. And you tell me whether this church is successful or not. He said, okay. I said, the church has been around for 75 years. In the 75 years, it's never been larger than 100. Can that church be considered successful? He looked at me and he said, no, of course not. I said, okay, then let me give you another template. In the 75 years that pastor or that church has been in existence, they are accountable for 11 missionaries, 22 pastors, and 1 general superintendent. Now, can that church be considered successful in its ministry? There was no answer. Why? It's because in our rural communities, we have to focus on church health. Small by itself is not the answer. We can grow, but if we place a primary focus on growth, we lose. Because if we place a primary context and focus on health, healthy things grow. And so that's what we're wanting to do in this next year, and we need your prayers, big time. As we begin to elevate the visibility of rural ministry and small church ministry across our movement, I want to see God do some powerful things that we can point to, and we can see maybe some of the same benefits that we saw with the Philippine Islands during the decade of harvest. God wants to touch our lives. God bless you.
Caught you off guard. Did I turn this one on? Or is it on? Hello?
Hello.
There you go.
I just want to ask you a question. You mentioned about help, and obviously we want help. You know, I saw Kevin somewhere, Kevin Reich's right over here, and Kevin currently is leading our reset part of church multiplication. And one of the things he's doing is TCCN, Turnaround Church Coaching Network. And he's doing that. There's some churches involved, but we believe there are some unique opportunities for smaller congregations across Oregon. And there's an Acts 2 journey that is specifically designed for smaller churches. The reason I'm saying this is I have asked Wes before he came if we could generate interest across the state of Oregon to have a systematic way to arrive at a plan like Joel spoke about earlier. Would there be interest? And can you just briefly tell us what that's about?
Yes. This actually began to come alive a few years ago. It was a very simple system that was utilized in one of our larger churches that actually caused the church to explode in its size. The problem that we sometimes have in our smaller churches and rural communities is exactly what I said. We have to somehow engage our congregations. And so many, not all of them, there are some of them that are very positive with this, but so many of our church health focuses and church revitalization focuses primarily focus on ministerial health and leadership health. In rural communities, we have to move beyond that to a point where the congregation sees itself primarily as ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, I believe that needs to happen within our whole movement as the Assemblies of God. I like to describe today's evangelical church as being very similar to Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl Sunday is where you have 22 men desperately in need of rest, being watched by 22 million men desperately in need of exercise. And that cannot happen in our local communities and our churches. We have a couple of problems. One, we've, in the Assemblies of God, only created resources for full-time people. Children's pastors, youth pastors, music pastors, most of our resources have been focused toward full-time people. One of the things we're intentionally doing is focusing toward causing the laity to begin to grow and really build themselves up. So the Acts 2 journey is basically a biblically based from Acts 2, 42 through 47 journey that is actually taught in 4 specific retreats. It's taught on a Friday only for pastors and their wives. And then on Saturday, the pastor then brings the leadership of his church and they begin the journey in 4 specific retreats. And what happens in that is that the pastor, instead of functioning as a catalyst for vision casting, functions as a facilitator for vision casting. So that in reality, he is sitting at the table with his leaders. Now, let me give you a word of caution here. We sometimes define leaders in terms of people that can do certain things. One of the most important lessons I learned in rural ministry is that some of the most effective leaders in the church were people of influence, not people of ability. And to identify those people of influence and then let them influence the congregation in a way that develops a vision statement of focus and a direction to reach the community. Secondly, it's focused not on just the church building. It is primarily focused on the community itself. Why? Because you've learned, if you're a rural pastor, that your success will be determined to a great extent by lifting up your eyes and looking beyond the 4 walls of your church and seeing yourself as the pastor of the community. Often, the best way that a pastor in a rural community can spend their Monday mornings is not in the office, but in a restaurant with a group of individuals getting to know the leadership of the town and working together with them. And so what we're actually doing is designing and have designed the Acts 2 model primarily to minister to rural and small churches who have somewhat limitations in what they can do and what they can afford. I talked to a young pastor the other day and he said, I want to go to a network and see what I can do with it, but for me to go is going to cost between $1,200 and $1,500 to go. Well, here's the good thing about it. Because of the efforts of Rural America Ministries Network, all people who attend, all churches who are part of the Acts 2 network are fully scholarshiped. So you can go for that time, bring your church through it, and we will pay the way. And so we're looking at that, and it's just exploded on us. So it's been great.
Yeah, and one of the things that we want to do, we'd love to consider bringing that to Oregon for our rural churches. You heard him talk about 4 weekends. That would be in a given year. I think it's a 2-year process, right? Wes has agreed that he would come out and help us. But to make this pencil to where we could do this free of charge to you, we need about 10 churches to be involved. So we've got some clipboards that are going to go around. If we could start those sometime throughout the evening. If you're interested, you're not committing to it, you're expressing interest in it. Would you be interested in doing that if the Oregon Ministry Network, in association with Wes and his ministry, invested and made this possible at a minimal charge, if not free, to you guys? We would love to do that because we want to invest in you. It's not for our sake, it's for yours. It would come under our reset portion of our church multiplication, but it would be specifically designed and tailored for the rural communities. So that's what it would be about.
Exactly. There are 2 things that you would have to be able to commit to. One, you would commit to attending 4 breakout weekends. And the first day is for the pastor and his wife, where we deal with some very heartfelt issues. The second, which is a Saturday, it's your leaders. So you would have to have the opportunity of pulling your leaders together during that period of time. And here's what you would actually be doing. You'll be sitting around a table just like you are here. and we'll take a look at the 5 primary functions of the church. We take a look at discipleship, we take a look at evangelism, we take a look at ministry, we take a look at missions, and we take a look at worship, those 5 areas. And then the church will set together, the leaders will, around the table, and they will discuss issues based upon this word, and you facilitate it as a pastor. I dream of a church where. And you actually create a paper where that dream is put down in paper as to what you'd like to see your church become. When all of those papers are done, then you go back and begin to move through those papers so you can put it into a statement that is rolled out to the entire congregation. Then that congregation will actually create the vision statement and purpose statement voted on by the church themselves in some cases, and it begins to grow. Why is that important? It's when God calls you somewhere else and he calls a young man in, then the church sits down with the pastor and basically says, here's our vision statement. Can you help us reach it? And they embrace it over continuity and a longer term period of time.
So you can see why it would be extremely helpful. We will do this. We will attempt in every way, depending on the amount of involvement, to bring this regionally more to you, so you don't have to always come over to the I-5 corridor. So we'll do everything we can, but that requires you guys to sign up and be part of it. So sometime tonight, as Dwayne and some others have started this, but keep the clipboard going. Just there again, we're not going to inundate you with a lot of information. We want to see what kind of interest there is, and then we'll go from there, all right? And you don't have to, everybody doesn't have to fill this out. It really should be just whether your church, really it's a lead pastor involvement. If the lead pastor isn't on board, we're not going to do it in your church, just bottom line. Because he is the gatekeeper, and that's the way we function with the Organ Ministry Network. So that's the way we will do it, all right? So I'm going to ask Valerie, my assistant, to come up here.
Can I just mention one more thing? Be in prayer for us in the Rural American Ministries area. This is a new initiative. We're moving ahead aggressively. We're creating actually regional representatives that can help regional churches. And, I don't know if he will agree to it or not, but I think I found one tonight that would do a good job by the name of Joel. He would do a great job regionally with some of this. But people who are doing it, they don't leave their churches, but can assist and help churches in the area to know what is there. So be in prayer as we move forward.